Hi students, welcome to this lecture on the art of the ancient Near East. Basically, pretty short outline today. Obviously, we'll go over some of the key artworks that have come up for this material. Just to note, there are a couple other artworks, I'll show them to you here, that we're not going to go over in this lecture because I have posted really nice videos by using other sources online about each one of these artworks, but these are all very important and they bring up key terms and so forth, so be sure to watch those in the supplemental material for the week. But most of the things, there will be a few other things that we do have to talk about in this lecture that aren't covered elsewhere. And then at the end of the lecture, we'll talk about cultural heritage, what it means, and as well as restitution. And a lot of these objects have made their way into anthropology museums, archaeology museums, cultural heritage museums. And so that gets us to think about other questions, which is, what is the difference? Other questions such as, what is the difference between art and cultural heritage, art and artifact, that kind of thing, which will also come up in this week's discussion. So just a nice little map to get us situated. Today we're going to be talking about this little area in here, Mesopotamia. So this is something that you might have learned about in the past. These two rivers are incredibly important at this time in early civilization. The Euphrates River, this one here, and then the Tigris. And this area of land was incredibly fertile, so it became known as the Fertile Crescent because of these great rivers that run through it. And Mesopotamia, Meso is between the rivers. So we are going to look specifically at a couple. So there's all these great civilizations, really early civilizations that you've probably heard of before. But we're going to focus on objects from Susa and Ur and Uruk. So that's kind of where we're going to be today. I think we might go to Ashnuna too, but that might be also covered in the other supplemental material. But this is where we are, and it's important to note that this was incredibly booming part of the world at this point in ancient history, because you have this really fertile soil that's able to support civilizations, not only through agriculture, but through the use of the river for a variety of other things, including trade. So we'll talk a little bit about trade today as well. Just a reminder, as I already said, that these three really important artworks are also going to be covered in the assigned reading, as well as the other videos that are posted this week from Smart History. But let's look at this one together. So this is the Great Lyre with bull's head. This was found in Ur, and you saw it on the map. This is modern day Iraq. It was found in a royal burial site, so in a royal tomb. As some of you might know, is at this time in history, in ancient history, and the Egyptians did this as well, a lot of these early civilizations buried their royalty with a lot of really amazing, valuable objects as well, the objects of the royal person who's being buried. So a lot of these early tombs that have been excavated, this is where we find a lot of really great early art. Right now, this object is located in the Pennsylvania Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology. Sorry for the typo there. The reason why it's here and not in Iraq is because when it was found, the University of Pennsylvania archaeologists found it. And at the time, Iraq had an agreement with archaeologists who were excavating there that some objects got to stay in Iraq and some got to go to Pennsylvania. So this is at the museum there, the Pennsylvania Museum, and you can find it there still. But this does get us thinking about restitution, right? Where does this object belong? And should it be back in Iraq, or should it be here in the United States? And we'll talk more about that later. But it is in an anthropology and an archaeology museum. So it gets us thinking about whether or not, this is an object that is useful. It is a lyre. That term might be new to some of you. A lyre is actually kind of a form of an early harp. So it is an instrument that would have been played. And we'll actually see how the piece itself references itself on the front panel. We'll look closely at that in a second. You can see a little image of the harp on the front of the harp itself. So the bull's head, as you see here, it's representational. You can tell it's a bull, but it's also incredibly stylized, right? Bulls don't actually have beautiful curly-haired beards or blue-tipped horns, right? Or hair on the top of their head that's blue. So you see that it is stylized, but it is a bull. The materials that you see here are a gold leaf and lapis lazuli. It would have been incredibly expensive to have a fully gold head. So what oftentimes you see happening is thin layers of gold that are made incredibly thin, and we call this gold leaf, and then pressed over another hard surface. So here, the hard surface would have been wood, so most of the lyre is made out of wood, and then the gold is just pounded into a thin layer, and then wrapped on top of a carved wooden bull's head. So that's what you see here. It's important to note that the wood that you see here, I should have actually added another image so you could see it fully. But the wood that you see here is not the original wood. This has been reconstructed. Over time, wood deteriorates quickly. So obviously this is from 2,600, 2,500 years before the Common Era. So that's 2,600 years before year zero, and now we're in 2,000 years after that. So over 4,000 years old. So obviously this wood has deteriorated over time, but archaeologists have kind of captured what it would have been like by recreating the lyre based on the images that we see in contemporary Mesopotamian culture that would have shown the lyre in use. So we have a pretty good idea of how it would have actually looked. The other thing that is important, the other important material here is lapis lazuli. Lapis lazuli is a beautiful precious gem stone. You can see a big chunk of it here. It's this blue stone that has like flakes of gold in it, and it's really, really gorgeous. Now this stone would have actually had to have been imported from Afghanistan. So because of this, we know a little bit more about trade routes, and we know that present-day Iraq would have had regular trade with Afghanistan, and that this object would have been more valuable because of that. So that's the blue that you see there is actually a blue stone called lapis lazuli. Tells us a lot about trade at the time. And now let's look at this panel right in front as well. This is incredibly interesting, and it brings up a couple of really great terms that are also used throughout the history of art. But art historians used to like to use the term registers. And we've already talked about this, I believe, at least once, but it'll come up again and again, especially in ancient art. This is the use of horizontal bands to divide space within a composition. And so you see here there are 4 registers, so 1, 2, 3, and 4. These are like basically little spaces that divide, oftentimes horizontal bands that divide a composition. We see this a lot as well in Egyptian art, which we'll get to in the next few weeks, and other works in Mesopotamia as well. So let's look at these panels. Oops, I'm getting ahead of myself. So we'll start from the bottom. Actually, we'll start with the lyre itself. So I told you that this lyre is actually self-referential. There's an image of someone playing it, actually not someone, something, an animal. So you see animals in this register here, and actually in the one above it as well, who seem to be conducting kind of some sort of duty as part of the funeral party, as part of the funeral procession and ceremony. So there seems to be a donkey who is playing this harp, and you can see there is actually a bull's head on the front of it, so we know it's likely would have looked like the one that we have here. So there would have been music. This would have been very traditional. A bear also secures part of the harp and might be holding some sort of instrument here. And then there's a small fox who seems to have a rattle. So it's likely that there would have been music at these ceremonies, and the harp, like this harp, would have been used. In fact, this harp was actually buried on top of the body of a woman who was likely the player of the harp. This is very common in Egypt as well, where the royalty would be buried with their servants and people who worked for them, people who were close to them. Perhaps this woman who was buried with this harp, who possibly was the person who played it, was also sacrificed when the ruler died, and then buried with her. And of course, in Egyptian mythology, we know that this typically, the idea was that then the person who's passed away gets to move on to the afterlife with their possessions and with the people who matter to them, the people who can help them to have a kind of successful and comfortable life in the afterlife. So perhaps that is also happening here, but here you see the animals partaking in this ceremony. In this register here, the third one from the bottom, you see more animals, but this time they have food. And again, they seem to be in a procession. The lion holds kind of a vessel, which likely would have been holding wine. He also has a cup of some sort. So he's holding, wine for the ceremony, food for the ceremony. And then this animal here, the hyena, seems to be acting as a butcher. So he holds a table with meat on top, right, animal meat, and then he has a knife around his waist as well. So those are fairly clear to art historians, kind of what's happening there. The top and the bottom panels are a little more difficult to decipher. We'll go to the bottom first, where we seem to see a kind of scorpion man. There's another animal with a large vessel and cups, so it's likely that these figures are also partaking in the ceremony, and maybe we, of course, have cups, vessel, maybe some wine. There's a lot of wine drinking at this time in history. But then we have this scorpion man. And something that's come up for art historians is that it's possible that this man actually comes from a story. This is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Some of you might have heard of this before. This is an epic poem that has about 3,000 lines in it. This would have been an epic and iconic poem in Sumerian literature. So would have been really well known, or is really well known right now. This poem outlines and brings up really interesting characters, and one of whom is this scorpion man. So it's possible that this is a reference to that. But then on the other side of that, the Epic of Gilgamesh actually wasn't written down actually written down until 700 years after the Great Lyre that you see here. So it might actually have more to do with the prevalence of oral tradition at the time. So it's possible that the Epic of Gilgamesh perhaps started as an oral tradition that had to do with the scorpion man, and then over time that was written down. But historians have nonetheless made links between this mysterious scorpion man and the Epic of Gilgamesh. Of course, we don't know. This is something that I talked about in the intro lecture, where we talked about ancient art and how we just really don't know. All this is based on speculation and what historians have read into it, the meaning that we've placed onto these things, and the context that we've studied. And now when we go to the top, we can also see another figure. Possible, this could be someone from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Within these poems, there's talk about bulls with men who have human heads. There's a hero in the story. Perhaps this could be the hero from that story. The other thing that this could be is that it could be the ruler who's been buried here, who is kind of flanked by these kind of mythical creatures as well. So again, we just don't know. Could just be a heroic image of the deceased, but nonetheless, it makes up this really, really wonderful and beautiful ancient Near Eastern artwork. that we have to study today. And really the most exciting thing for most of us is that we actually have an image of the harp here. And as I said earlier, this is the reason why we're able to reconstruct it and make it look the way that it does in the museum today, even though all the wooden parts were actually disintegrated by the time it was found. So let's keep thinking about registers, because we're going to look at one more piece. This is the carved vessel, otherwise known as the Worker Vase. This too has registers. You can see it has a variety. It has, and it's has been broken and restored. So you can see it looks all cracked up. But here's another image of it that's oh, I think I have a better image. Maybe not. Oh, I thought I had a little better one. Okay. So you can see this image though shows it in the round. So you can see it from all sides. The carvings actually move completely around it. And we have, again, 4 horizontal bands. These are registers that do divide this space for us. So let's look closely at this. And again, this is from Uruk. You might recall from the map we looked at. So this is modern day Iraq, right in that same area in the Fertile Crescent, okay? Another key term I'd like to bring up today is low relief, and this will come up in the videos that I posted for the other artworks as well. We have high relief and low relief. This vocabulary pertains to the way that things are carved. So if something is high relief, the images, the objects that are carved come off the background quite a bit. If something is low relief, like you see here, the sculpted relief with figures are only projected slightly from a recessed background. So these figures don't come too far off the background, so we will call them low relief. Now let's look at the registers here. So let's look to the bottom first. So basically, this was also found this was found in a temple. This was found in the temple of Inanna, who would have been the patron saint of the city of Worka at the time. And so it's very likely that this has much to do with her, and we'll talk about her more when we see the upper register. But we'll start with the bottom register here. So here you have kind of these wavy lines, which are supposed to be symbolic of water, we think. And then right above them, you have plants, right? Plant life. So it's likely that we have reeds and a form of grain, likely barley. And so of course the water, the water of the river being really the life force for everything in the Fertile Crescent, everything between the Tigris and the Euphrates, really being this fertile ground, a great place to raise a civilization. And so we have that at the bottom register. And the second register from the bottom has rams, it has ewes, it has male and female sheep, as you see, in procession being herded. They seem to be very close, and it makes this really beautiful rhythmic pattern around the lower part of the vase. And so being emphasized here, it looks like what we see emphasized here is the importance of local agriculture, the importance of the harvest in Mesopotamia, and just how fertile the land is and how thriving the community at the time of Uruk was. And if we move up to the middle register, right below the top register, you also see a type of procession, but this time with naked men who walk in the opposite direction. Again, this really beautiful kind of pattern where we see them walking. And since they're naked, it's really likely that they were either servants or slaves. Many times if you see nudity in these early sculptures, it means these are people who didn't have a lot of money, so probably servants or slaves, people who served the royals. All of these people seem to be holding vessels as well, some with fruit, some with grains, some with wine. So again, getting back to the importance of the local harvest, the local food, everything kind of being in abundance here to make everything work in Mesopotamia and in Uruk. And here we have the top panel. Now it has been broken, as I said. It was found in shards and then placed together. But let's look to the top register where you can see, you know, the whole thing has kind of been reconstructed in a drawing here, whereas the ruler would be right here, as you can see him here, but he doesn't really exist anymore. That part is missing, but there's part of his dress and the back of his kind of gown that would represent, that have made it so that art historians and archaeologists can tie him to the ruler. Another key term here for this image, and we've seen it many times already, we'll see it in ancient Egypt again. This is hierarchy of scale. This is the use of different sizes to indicate relative importance. So for instance, you see the largest figure here is probably the king, right? The most important figure is larger. So the more important someone is, the bigger they usually are. So the servants look a lot smaller, right? It's not that they probably would have been like small people or children. They've just been rendered smaller because they're not as important. And we see that often in art, and we'll see it again. So again, that term is hierarchy of scale. So let's look again closely. You see a servant here, and he is holding this really elaborately carved part of the ruler's dress, the ruler's garb. The reason why we can tell this is the ruler is because archaeologists and art historians have looked at other coins and seals at the time that were also found in this area. And anytime that we see this ruler represented, they're always wearing this type of garb. So it's very likely that this is where the ruler would have been standing in the procession here. So we were looking at the ruler on this side. Now we're going to look over here at a woman on the other side of him. A servant is in between, seems to be offering a vessel with an abundant amount of food in it. And it's likely, and this is what historians have come to decide about this female figure, is that, okay, there's a man and a woman here. The man is likely the king, and the woman is likely tied to this important goddess, the patron saint of Uruk, Inanna. So it's likely it's her because behind her we see these large reeds. These reeds are a symbol of her. And so it's likely that that's her as well. And she and the king seem to be the most important figure, so it's likely that she is also this goddess. She's the goddess. Sorry about that, students. I think my internet cut out and then I wasn't sure if it was recording, and I think it was. So if I sat there staring at the screen for a second, please ignore that. It looks like it's back on. As I was saying, the patron saint of Uruk, and so it's likely that he's trying to please her here in the top register of this vase. And then behind them, and you can see it in this image as well, behind these giant reeds, you also see another ram, and on its back, let's see if we can zoom in a little bit. On its back, it's basically holding up some pedestals, and on these pedestals there are statues who also seem to be holding objects. They seem to be holding more kind of gifts of food, wine vessels, these kinds of things. So throughout we see this, and actually behind them there's these baskets basically on the ground full of food, two more vessels hovering in the air, and these actually look a lot like the Worker Vase. So again, kind of an artwork referencing itself, just as we saw earlier with the bullhead's lyre. So we see this often, right? So we have all this happening, and really you just have an abundance of offerings. So what could this be all about? Well, it's likely, many historians do believe that this is kind of an early artwork that is referencing the king, like the duty of the king through art. So showing us, showing his patrons and showing his, the patron saint, of this town, that he will do anything for her, that he worships her, and it's his duty as king to worship her to ensure agricultural abundance in the region. Because all of this doesn't just come from anywhere, right? It's because he worships her, the town worships her, and she's good to them by providing them with everything they need. So this is where we kind of have this overarching theme of prosperity, abundance throughout the vase. It's also important to note that, oh, what was I going to say? I just lost my train of thought. I can't remember. Okay, we'll just move on. I had another key point I wanted to bring up, but that's okay. So basically, that's all we're going to talk about with this vase today. The other thing that is important to note about this piece is, and we'll look at another slide in just a moment, is that this piece was stolen in 2003. It was looted from the museum and then returned a few months later. So that, has probably made it so that it's increasingly important to us because it went through this ordeal as well. And now the last few things we're going to talk about are cultural heritage and restitution. So what is heritage? It is property, something that is inherited, passed down from previous generations. In the case of cultural heritage, heritage doesn't consist of money or property. It could also be culture, values, traditions, things that you hold dear, right? So think of some things that you think of as cultural heritage. It implies a shared bond, our belonging to a community. It represents our history, our identity, our bond to the past, to the present, to the future. Now, how does this overlap with art? Well, oftentimes artifacts actually are forms of cultural heritage. Paintings, drawings, prints, mosaics, sculptures, historical monuments, buildings, as well as archaeological sites. Human creativity and expression, photographs can be cultural heritage, documents, books, instruments, songs, oral history, traditions, performing arts, social practices, all of these are types of cultural heritage. There is a foundation called UNESCO, you might have heard of it, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. It was founded in 1954, and this is an organization created to implement international conventions on the protection of cultural heritage. So for the instance of this class, many times we have specific sites that are the now protected. But the question that this raises is who owns cultural heritage and how can heritage become blurred over time and space? So you do have a map here of all the cultural heritage sites that are registered through UNESCO since the 1950s. Notice a lot of them are in this ancient, the area that we think of most of our ancient art coming from in Western Egypt, and then kind of Near Eastern part of the continent there as well. Of course, many down here in Mexico and South America as well. And that gets us thinking about war, looting, and restitution. So as I said, in April of 2003, the Iraq National Museum in Baghdad was looted, and it was unguarded right after the American invasion in Iraq. Thousands of objects were taken, including the Worker head, as you see here, and the Worker carved vessel, that vase that we were just looking at. This is a pedestal that has the base of the vase on it. Basically, thieves broke the glass and severed the top from the bottom and stole it. There was an amnesty program created for the safe return of these objects, and a couple months later, so that thieves could be pardoned without, consequences if they returned it, and this was the vase was returned in June. So that gets us thinking about things taken during war and issues like this, things that happen during war. So where do things belong and where are things from? Well, the other thing that we have to talk about within this conversation is restitution. So this is the demand for the return of works of art and cultural property acquired under disputable circumstances. Oftentimes these things happen as spoils of war, and many objects are currently housed outside of their country of origin in national and civic museums, and most of them are in the United States and in Western Europe. For instance, you're going to look at this piece and this piece, the stele of Narm-Sin and then the stele of Hammurabi. Both of these, you know, are from ancient Near East, but they both reside in the Louvre in Paris. So they were taken during times of war. Napoleon Bonaparte, you might have heard of him, is well known for taking artworks as spoils of war during his reign and bringing them back to France. And so many of them were just there. And then, of course, we have this huge museum, the Louvre, which now houses many of these works. The Rosetta Stone, an ancient piece of ancient Egyptian art, which we'll talk about next week, found in Egypt, but now in the British Museum. So where does it really belong? It's an incredibly important artifact that shows 3 different languages. In fact, the Rosetta Stone is the reason why we can decipher hieroglyphs. So all of these really important, and where do they belong? Do they belong with the countries of origin, who could make some money off of them, or do they belong in these Western institutions who, you know, arguably already make a lot of good money off of the other things they own? So this is a big question. It's something I'll have you think about more later in the course when we actually have a mock trial on this, but something that it's important to come up with Near Eastern and also, as you see, Egyptian artifacts as well. I hope you all have a great week. Sorry this was so long, and we'll talk next week.